So welcome to everybody. My name is Gaëtan Cliquennois. I'm the head of the Center of Constitutional Politics here at the Mathias Corvinus Collegium. I will briefly introduce our panelists in a few minutes. Just some technical remarks at the start. I will briefly introduce our panelists. Then each of them will have 10, maximum 15 minutes for comments on Gaëtan books, and then Gaëtan will have the chance to reply to the comments or critics of his books. But critics are also welcomed, of course, also from the audience, of course. So welcome to everybody to this book symposium on Gaëtan Cliquennois' new book. It was published last year, 2021, at the Cambridge University Press. And this is the focus of our event. I mean, this book is, we are focusing on this book. So let me introduce first the panelists. Kerstin Lone is an associate professor at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo. She has previously worked at several institutions like the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Pluricourts, and the Department of Public and International Law at the University of Oslo. She has been a visiting researcher at the Center for International Criminal Justice in Amsterdam and the Center for Criminology at the University of Oxford. She published widely in criminology and human rights NGOs, and one of her most relevant in the sense that relevant concerning our event. So one of her most relevant publications include Advocates of Humanity, Human Rights NGOs in International Criminal Justice, published by the Oxford University Press in 2019. Kersti, welcome. I will introduce all of other colleagues and then give you the floor first. Christina Parau is an associate member of the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. She specializes in transnational public policymakers and their interactions with domestic institutions and supranational regimes, especially Council of Europe and the European Union. She has also investigated the influence of Europeanization on state-civil society relations in Eastern Europe after the fall of the communism, which led to many, including also several prize-winning publications. She's currently researching the politics of net zero decarbonization in response to a new global and transnational normative regime. The most relevant one of the most relevant publications, once again, concerning our event is Transnational Networks and Elites and Self-Empowerment, the Making of Judiciary in Contemporary Europe and Beyond, being published also by the Oxford University Press in 2019. Christina, welcome, also among us. Rosalind Fuller has been studying the history of democracy and international institutions and alternative practices in democracy for over a dozen years. She is interested in infusing the ancient ideas of the Athenian democracy with the participatory potential of modern informational technology. She got her PhD in international law from the Trinity College, Dublin. She is the founder and director of the Solonian Democracy Institute, which maps the emergence of democracy-enabling technologies and companies, and her most relevant publications include In Defense of Democracy, published by Polity Press in 2019 as well. Rosalind, welcome. And last but not least, Mikael Madsen is professor of the Faculty of Law at the University of Copenhagen and at the same time head of the Center of the Excellence for International Courts at the same institution. His research is focused on globalization and the role of legal institutions and professionals in these processes. His current research concerns the special interaction between law and global integration, the role and power of lawyers in globalization, the increased importance of supranational legal institutions, and his most relevant publications include the European Court of Human Rights, between law and politics. It's published by Oxford University Press in 2013, but there is a more recent publication also together with Karen Alter, Beyond Backlash, the Consequences of Adjudicating Mega Politics. It's published in the journal Law and Contemporary Problem. Unfortunately, Leonard Chandler could not join us. He got ill actually yesterday evening, so we miss Leonard. But let me introduce very briefly our protagonist today, who is Gaëtan Cliquennois, is professor at the University of Nantes and director of the Law and Social Change Research Center. He was a research fellow at the College of Europe, visiting research fellow at the European University Institute and at the London School of Economics. He got his PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. His most relevant publications include, of course, the European Human Rights, Justice and Privatisation, the growing influence of foreign private funds, published by the Cambridge University Press. So that's for the introduction. And then I would give the floor to Kirsty to make her comments in 10 minutes. Kirsty, the floor is yours. Kirsty, can you hear us? No? Perhaps I will write in the chat something.
Oh, otherwise we can.
Yeah, we can go to.
Or,
yes, we can
or
go.
Michael or
Yes.
Or Rosalind. I don't know.
Yes. So, all right. So yeah, I just finished the introduction actually, and the floor would be yours, Kirsty. So we can hear now. We can't hear now you.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. The floor is yours for 10 or 15 minutes.
Thanks. Yes, so hi, and thank you very much for this invitation to this event and the opportunity to read and comment on this book. I can start by saying that it has been a real joy to read this work, this intriguing work, and that I am far from having thought through the meaning and the implications of this book. But I do hope that our conversation today will contribute to this regard. Now, of course, this book speaks to a very different world today than it did at the time when this event was originally scheduled. Today, the Second World War, Cold War, as you referred to in your book, is getting hotter by the minute. Russia has not only invaded Ukraine, but of particular interest for our breed of scholars. They have also been thrown out from the Council of Europe and the Human Rights Council. The International Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights both issued orders on interim measures for Russia to cease their hostile activities. And the International Criminal Court has never moved quicker to investigate a situation, now even teaming up on the ground with the European Joint Investigation Team. Yesterday, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe also joined several international legal scholars in calling for the establishment of an ad hoc international criminal tribunal to hold individuals, that is Putin, responsible of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The point being, a joint international legal community, courts and institutions, legal norms, legal scholars, human rights scholars are joined by European states, politicians and citizens in a collective condemnation of Putin's Russia. So if for some reason people have missed that they've been considered a pariah state for, well, a while, then they certainly haven't missed it now. So why do I bring this up? Instead of talking more directly about the content of your book, which I will do in just a sec, the reason is we write about the world, we write for the world, and we write in the world. And this is what we are part of. In reading your book, I am very confident that I understand and sympathize with your view on power in global governance, which is really what I've seen that you've written about, although you frame it in different terms. But this makes me all the more curious, given your superb insight and knowledge of current trends and current politics, of how you see the world today, how you see Russia's actions, how you see Ukraine's actions, and not the least, how you see the actions of the international legal community. Are there any underlying agendas here that you can help us see? And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, which obviously goes beyond your book, but that I consider to be incredibly important. Now your book, brilliant. How complete with explosive knowledge based on such extensive and thorough, and I must say colossal data. I am very impressed by your ability to collect and systematize and intellectually analyze this much data, and it must have taken you quite a while. But above all, what a topic you've chosen. You're a senior scholar, you've worked on several topics, many of which I would be happy to discuss at a later time, but this one, the influence of private funds on the development and practice, meaning even on human rights in Europe, is nothing short of excellent and terribly, terribly important. I think that enthusiastic young international law and human rights lawyers should all read this book, not to make them cynical, that's not what the world needs, but to raise their awareness of the context, of the influence, of the economy, and of the politics of law. For them to be better guardians of the system that they are part of, they should be armed with the type of empirical data that you provide in your book. And I am here today because I wrote about the influence of human rights NGOs in international criminal justice. And I think I wrote either a page or a footnote about the funders of these NGOs. So by and large, the same ones that you have subjected to such critical scrutiny. And I'm so terribly happy that you did so, because even though I didn't write much about it, I thought about it a lot. Because these same names kept popping up all over, right? These same funders, and especially the Open Society Foundation and George Soros. So it gave me such joy to read your pages about him, and especially your sections about the lack of attention to austerity politics in the practice and attention of both the European Court of Human Rights and the NGOs and private funds alike. So enough with the compliments. I really enjoyed reading your book. It is knowledge that I will build on and distribute to students and other scholars. But this excitement also means that I want more, right? I'm not completely satisfied, one never is, I guess, but perhaps you can share more with us here than that I would also have liked to read about or learn about, perhaps in another book, although I do see that you already have another one in the pipeline. But I mentioned briefly that I see your work as essentially a work on power in global governance. Your book is very disciplined. Your introduction and the literature review is very tightly linked to your subject, the impact of private foundations on European justice institutions. And this obviously makes sense. But I would also have liked more engagement with other types of literature, the kind perhaps represented here today on this panel on transnational networks, on legitimacy, on class, on elites even. The issue of legitimacy is touched upon in the foreword and the conclusion of the book, but this, I think, could have easily been a chapter on its own, right? And you could also, as you already do indicate, link it to wider issues of backlash, but also even to backlash of the European project generally, prior to the Russian invasion, obviously. In other words, I think that this book, or I know that this book raises so many analytical questions, so many significant questions that go beyond your immediate empirical focus. And I would therefore really have enjoyed more sort of theoretical guts, right? For you to elevate your analysis from this sort of meso level to the macro level. So yes, you've convinced us, or at least me, about the existence of this phenomenon, this impact of private foundations on European human rights. But how did it really develop? What does it compare with? What does it really mean for the institutions of justice and human rights? And overall, what does it say about power dynamics in the world generally? So in other words, I would have loved for your analysis to go a bit higher, to elevate itself. And I would also, to be frank, have liked to read an analysis that also went deeper. And what do I mean by that? You situate your work as socio-legal, and you refer to a methodology that also includes interviews. I would have liked to see more engagement in the text with how your analysis also contributes to the literature on, for instance, strategic litigation, legal mobilization, cost lawyering, as well as what these interviews did for your analysis. How do they do their strategic litigation? How do they do their lobbying in practice? How do they gain access to the reform process of the European Court? Because it isn't the board members and the directors that do the everyday lobbying, litigation, advocacy, reporting, traveling, in short, the actual work of NGOs. This, I guess, is probably a group of people much younger, much more female, much more idealistic, with much less in their bank account and fewer transnational connections and board memberships. So I'm curious to your insights on the everyday work of these NGOs, and not just on the money behind them, although obviously I am biased in this interest. But I also found it fascinating that there is no critical commentary on the use of NGO reports as evidence in these courts. This has been a huge debate in international criminal justice, although perhaps because criminal trials have a higher standard of proof. But still, the reliance on this type of evidence is noteworthy. I would love to hear your reflection on this too. And finally, I especially liked your observation as to the tension between the NGO's own embeddedness and their vocal protection of the independence of the European Court in the reform process. It's ironic, isn't it? And I recognize this from the ICC too, where the NGOs often seem to argue for protecting the integrity and the universality of the justice system instead of recognizing the diplomatic work that needs to be done to achieve universality in practice. At the same time, their claim to moral authority seemed to blindside them from recognizing their own political authority in a system where they cannot, frankly, legitimize such power. And I think you contribute real insight here, and I look forward to following your work on this matter and others in the near future. So these were my initial comments, at least, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and not the least those of my distinguished co-panelists. So thank you.
Thank you, Kirsa, for your comments. And now I give the floor to Christina. Christina, it is yours.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Can you still see the slides?
Yes.
The same slides, right?
The same slide, yes.
Okay.
Is it a problem that we see the same slide, or we should see another one?
No, you should. Do you see a black screen or?
No, it's okay.
We can see the
Perfect.
slide.
Already justice.
That's fine. Now I just need to shift something out of the way. That's it. Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's a great pleasure to review this book, not only because it is very interesting and pioneering, but also because there is so much in it that corroborates my own monograph. I think our books complement each other quite well, both in terms of methodology and findings. And I will not provide a comprehensive summary of Professor Cliquennois' book. It suffices to say that, in my opinion, its most important contribution is to discern a pattern in philanthropic foundation activity of shaping the supranational courts into a tool for their own agenda. I've chosen to focus on what I think is always the most difficult aspect of qualitative research, drawing inferences about motivation, because motivation cannot be observed directly and has to be inferred. And the difficulty is compounded when the empirical evidence does not support the conventional wisdom. So what motivates these foundations? Professor Cliquennois finds that the board members of many of them are part of the super rich world of international finance, business and finance. And he infers that they pursue goals that are exclusively commercial. Litigation is weaponized to break the power of nation states in order to substitute their own globalizing interests, which is to maximize their wealth. This explanation is the familiar Homo economicus model, which has become the default inference of motivation in the social sciences. It assumes that rational actors choose from available courses of action that which maximizes their utility. In game theory, utility is defined as a measure of satisfaction. But the question being begged is, what is the content of utility for the billionaires behind these foundations? Are they in it for purely commercial gains? Is there a utility for them that is not commercial? The commercial motive is certainly there, but by itself is one-dimensional and reductionistic. Professor Cliquennois might have given himself more leverage had he conceptualized the main actors in his drama as oligopolists. Unlike conditions of pure market competition, where profits are earned by a large number of sellers, in oligopoly, only a few sellers suck up the lion's share of the profits and therefore become incredibly wealthy. An oligopoly is concentration of wealth. The very existence of billionaires who could create the foundations studied by Professor Cliquennois constitutes evidence that vast sectors of our markets have been oligopolized. Oligopolists are such that they already have plenty of wealth, and simply more wealth is an activity with diminishing marginal utility. There are other motives in life that can be achieved through wealth. The most recent example is that of Elon Musk buying up Twitter in order to make it a free speech platform. Oligopolists are no strangers to each other. They know each other, they go to the same clubs and resorts, they collude, as Adam Smith put it. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Conspiracy against the public suggests that oligopolies are inherently political. This is why economists theorize oligopoly in political terms using game theory. They are interested in capturing not only courts, the theory through which Professor Cliquennois interpreted his findings, but all non-majoritarian institutions and even Parliament itself. Some evidence of full spectrum state capture does exist in Professor Cliquennois' book, but not in a unifying theory. He states, for example, that philanthropic foundations, such as the Open Society Justice Initiative, works with governments to transform policies and advocates with decision makers for change. Once captured, the state obeys them, not the electorate. This goes beyond commercial motives alone. It is open-ended political power because they get to be higher up on the chain of command compared to everybody else. Aristotle said that man is the political animal. Oligopolists inevitably constitute themselves as an oligarchy. The oligarchy that Professor Cliquennois began to reveal is in process of transforming wealth into political power, in part through selective conditional grant making for strategic litigation. These oligarchs keep themselves at arm's length from public controversy by funding so-called civil society to litigate on their behalf. The NGOs he researched are creatures of oligopolistic wealth and ambition. Only a smattering of NGOs are truly grassroots. They are nothing like the bottom-up civil society described by de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. To wrap this up, the inference that the agenda is merely neoliberalism risks overlooking or missing much that we already know about the political ambition of oligopolistic oligarchs, such as the 19th century American robber barons. As the epithet suggests, they were already wedding the amassing of wealth with hierarchical command. Professor Cliquennois seems aware of this, saying, he cites the literature, litigation before the Strasbourg court has been turned into a new Cold War. Barons can wage war, including culture war. My interpretation of the evidence is that philanthropy is engaged more in a Kulturkampf than in a Cold War. Kulturkampf is a term often translated as culture war. It goes back to Bismarck and the Prussian Empire and the struggle over the rights of the Catholic Church, especially its domination in education. US Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia also used Kulturkampf in his dissent over the moral and legal status of homosexuality in Roma versus Evans, 1995. And in perusing the bibliography to Professor Cliquennois' book, I discovered an article by Christopher McCrudden, published in 2015, titled Transnational Culture Wars. The broad overlap of my independently drawn inference implies corroboration. Culture war is a power struggle, a politicization of culture and cultural traditions. And this is why Professor Cliquennois discerns a pattern of litigation against conservative values, nationalism, and traditional religions, including Christianity, and I would say primarily Christianity. In other words, the oligopolists seek to shift the moral values of whole nations in the direction they prefer, which is secularization or the disempowerment of cultural traditions. This is a full spectrum culture war, not limited to commerce. This is why the foundations care little about socioeconomic rights and their own vast wealth inequality. They are disempowering rights to welfare, which many Eastern European constitutions feature. They have a very selective interest in philanthropy. It is indeed striking that cases concerning welfare are brought to court by individual litigants, not by private foundations. Professor Cliquennois admits a political motive to destabilize nationalistic regimes that have resisted global neoliberalism. More empirical research and theoretical development is called for to connect the oligarchs with regime change. We might begin to get a grip on the mechanism if culture war is conceived as fighting for linguistic discursive territory in the same way empires fight for land and material resources. In other words, the culture war means colonizing other people's thinking. Our very assumption that billionaires are altruistic shows how effective they have been in colonizing our thinking. Can anyone control the narrative to such precision without owning and controlling the Leviathan media? What evidence is there in the book for a hegemonic discourse? We learn that Eastern European regimes that are philanthropists, the philanthropist enemies in the Kulturkampf are stigmatized, presumably by the media, as dangerously authoritarian, and one might add even anti-democratic and illegitimate. How ironic that the Washington Post, itself owned by Jeff Bezos of Amazon, would stigmatize Elon Musk's buyout of Twitter because he has a maverick agenda. When oligarchs colonize people's minds with a stigma, this goes beyond even culture war and becomes a coup d'etat. They have been very effective in using both litigation and the media as a battering ram to break down all opposing narratives. They define who is extreme and who is mainstream, who is a danger and who is one of us. The ultimate target of this stigma are the voters themselves who elect incorrect representatives. In other words, through the non-elected branches, the courts and the media, which carries their hegemonic discourse, the oligarchs are putting their thumb on the scale of electoral processes. Professor Cliquennois and myself are in agreement on this point. Where we differ is on reducing motivation to a commercial motive. The diminishing marginal utility of more wealth implies a transfer of attention to an accumulation of power, the utility of which is undiminishing. One can never have too much power for its own sake. Professor Cliquennois, neither Professor Cliquennois nor myself have sufficiently explored, for example, which corporate boards of directors interlock with the media. And I think this might be the next big push on the research agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, for your comments. And I'm also curious about Gaëtan's answers, but we have to wait still a little bit for the answers. And then now I give the floor to Rosalind. Rosalind, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'm really glad to be here to discuss such an important book, especially since it aligns so closely to some of the things I've taken an interest in myself. I started out in international law before moving into democracy, and most lately, researching the outsized powers of NGOs in the world today. And since that trajectory has a lot in common with the authors, it's not surprising that we have a similar view on some of these topics. This book, as we know, focuses particularly on cases brought before the European courts by large private foundations. And I agree entirely with Professor Cliquennois' hypothesis, which I think he proves more than adequately in this book, that this is part of a wider, very cynical, and deeply concerning strategy to affect policy in states via judicial means. In other words, we have a situation where private foundations are trying to do politics by essentially capturing the transnational judiciary. There are numerous issues with this. One is the overwhelming resources these extremely well-funded organizations are able to deploy. This was well documented in the book, how NGOs try to secure complex pilot judgments, the sheer number of cases taken, acting as what the author calls repeat players, submitting amicus curiae, even when there aren't compelling reasons for doing so, gathering evidence or relying on evidence gathered by sister organizations, monitoring the execution of judgments, and then lobbying governments and publishing coverage in media. This all adds up to attaining a hegemonic influence over the process. Like an overzealous parent, at a certain point, involvement becomes control. And I think Professor Cliquennois did a good job of making clear that this was his point. It isn't a matter of saying, we agree with this judgment or we agree with that judgment. The problem is that the system has been gamed, hacked, if you will, to do something different than it was intended to do, and that it would be doing if it were functioning properly. Something I'd like to draw particular attention to is how this affects democracy, which I think is an avenue that was opened up by this book, but it wasn't its primary focus. The legal system and the judiciary, as a third branch of government, are part of representative democracy. Judges are supposed to apply the law, not make it, and they're supposed to apply it in an impartial manner. Professor Cliquennois focused on how private foundations disproportionately target Russia and Eastern Europe, and undoubtedly they do. But in addition to using these judgments as an instrument of foreign policy, in my view, there's also a democracy-destroying component here that affects us all, regardless of the country we live in. NGOs have their place in democracy as vehicles of democratic action, civic associations, financed and run by ordinary citizens, so that everyone brings something to the table, but no one has exclusive control. The fact that NGOs are being financed top-down and run by paid staffers annihilates their democratic purpose and gives so few people such extreme control that I think we should seriously be asking if we don't need to change our laws governing nonprofit associations. When an institution that is supposed to serve a public good gets hacked to this extent, I think we need to change the rules so that those institutions again play a constructive role in democracy and are able to avail of protections in the intended manner. Related to this is that the judiciary is not the branch of government responsible for deciding basic policy. And when the judiciary starts to depart too severely and too often from what people thought they agreed on democratically, we end up with a crisis and the activation of the so-called counter-majoritarian difficulty. I don't per se disapprove of judicial activism or living constitutions, but the pendulum has swung too far in that direction, and I think we need some judicial restraint now. We need to go through democratic procedures to change laws and policy, not rely on international treaties that no one fully reads, interpreted by judges in ways the population didn't see coming. This is a circumvention of democracy, and I don't think it will end well. So much for democracy in the abstract. Let's move on to a more practical point Professor Cliquennois brings up, the content of decisions obtained by privately funded NGOs. I'm researching a different NGO complex at the moment, every bit as labyrinthine as this one. And I can only confirm that almost every NGO I have looked at over the past year is financed and staffed at the highest levels by hedge fund managers and wealth advisors and a few tech billionaires. Their position is not involved, their position is dominant. In my view, what we're seeing is a fight between globalist and nationalist forces, in a sense, between transnational elitism and somewhat less transnational populism. And in that fight, NGOs have been co-opted onto the elite side, which is where they are not supposed to be. What is the opposite of globalist? Well, it's nationalist. What is the opposite of elitist? Populist. It's become normal today for NGOs and others to accuse people of being populist merely because they do something popular. There is an antagonism to the idea that politicians in democracies, generally speaking, need to do popular things and to try avoid doing things people don't like. Instead, the official mantra is that politicians have to make hard decisions that their constituents don't like, or to bring about social change that is at least unclear if their constituents want in the modality it's being presented. Likewise, it has become anathema to act in the national interest. For a politician to say, I'm doing X or Y because it would be good for my country, even though that is literally the job that they've been hired to do. I think this reveals the deep contempt for people that I have observed in my many interactions with NGOs and other elites. To them, people are without a doubt stupid, and they must be guided to do the right things. Furthermore, they aren't just contemplating a withering of the nation state, they're acting like it already doesn't exist, which is foolhardy. So we've taken what was just a little while ago normal functioning democracy and turned it into populist nationalism. And there is a method to this madness, because those right decisions, as Professor Cliquennois pointed out, are usually things that benefit the very wealthy. And there's a tendency to adopt cost-saving neoliberal solutions. Like, for example, not sending convicted people to jail, rather than cost-intensive, possibly more effective solutions, like better education opportunities, better counseling provision, affordable housing, and a life that gives people dignity. Of course, if someone wants those neoliberal policies, fine, run for office. But don't send money cascading through thousands of different organizations, focusing on things like locking in judgments, which is quite sinister and lacks openness. I personally take great hope from the fact that this smacks of desperation. There is justifiably deep dissatisfaction with neoliberalism, and there are plenty of good, popular solutions for recalibrating society in ways that aren't even that radical, but more beneficial to the average person. So my theory is that rather than being agents of change, as they like to present themselves, their most important objective is to prevent change they don't like by preventing actual civil society organizations, grassroots organizations, from getting anywhere. And of course, in my view, influencing courts is part of that. Some questions that have been raised in my mind after reading this book. One, where does this leave us on cross-border political interference? There are so many ways to influence other countries' politics at this point. What can and should we do? Two, I think another point to consider here is that maybe the elephant in the room is the European project and the impatience to create a United States of Europe. Naturally, we meld over time. It's how we have our national identities today, but there seems to be an urgency to force that which really can't be forced here. And thirdly, and finally, another issue is human rights and the international legal regime versus geopolitical reality. We've seen how things have turned out with Ukraine. And I don't just mean the situation in Ukraine, but the attitude. It should be dawning on us that Russia does not care very much what our opinion is anymore. And I think we all know China's just pretending. I think that by cynically using international law to achieve geopolitical ends, we contributed to emptying it of its value. There is no incentive to comply with this system, so it isn't surprising that people aren't. That's a pity, because there are parts of international law that are very useful. Unfortunately, by letting a few oligarchic actors treat systems like international law and the courts that interpret it like their personal playthings to achieve their own ends, we've undermined something very important to us all. We're seeing some of the backlash to this today in Ukraine, and personally, I think we may well see backlash to it on a national level as well. The constant screaming about the far right has desensitized the elites themselves to this threat. But it would not be terribly surprised to see an actual far right or far left party come to power, and not necessarily by votes. So those are my thoughts. As I said, I think it is a very good book, very thorough, with a very clear argument, regrettably on a topic that a lot of people have decided they don't want to hear about.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Razin, for your comments. Last but not least, I will give the floor to Mikael once again for 10-15 minutes, and then to Gaëtan for the answers. I mean, after Gaëtan gave the answers, please feel free to intervene anytime. So it will be a less rigid form of conversation. So Mikael, just go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Gaëtan on this excellent book and for inviting me to participate in this event. As a sociologist of law, I'm always a bit thrilled when I read a compatriot, someone who is resolutely socio-legal in his approach, like Gaëtan definitely is. And a bit like Kirsty said, I would have loved to have had a little bit more about how it was all done. You know, giving some insights in how you conduct this study more generally and who they are, the people that were interviewed and you gather data about. I know that publishers don't like to have those parts. They like to skip them, but as researchers, I think they're very interesting, and both for checking validity, but certainly also to get inspired. Some more praise. I think that the social world that you are unearthing has been relatively little explored in research related to these courts, and you're really making a key contribution there. And this is, of course, as already said, you know, quite impressive, the amount of empirical work that goes into this. This is literally not just years, but decades of work that's accumulated into making this possible. Another thing I noticed when I read it, and it's maybe because of my own background, is that I like the way you use different literatures, because you take advantage of where you are, that you know, the French sort of political sociology literature, which goes about many of the issues you tackle in quite a different way than what's typical in other literatures. It's of course perhaps a puzzle that in 2022 that we can find these clusters of different linguistically specific literatures, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, particularly if you are, as you, capable of mastering both camps, and it has a very positive effect on the final product in my view. But enough of praise. Now some more or less tough questions. First, a little bit of a devil's advocate question. And that is basically, and it links a little bit to what Roslyn said, but perhaps going the opposite direction. It is, how pervasive is your phenomenon in the bigger picture? I know well the literature on mobilization you cite. I've had many discussions with some of those authors about precisely the pervasiveness of their object of inquiry. But to give an illustration, on page 34, you write, and I quote, "Since 2004, the Open Society Justice Initiative has indeed taken no fewer than 47 cases to the European Court of Human Rights and 2 cases to the Court of Justice." In the same period, of course, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in roughly 20,000 cases. So the question is, how much is this? How influential is this, besides some very specific issues where they have an interest? Clearly, statistically speaking, it's not a lot. And so there is a bigger question about how influential third-party interventions, NGOs, and so on actually are at the end of the day at these courts. And it's a bit of an, you know, a question that has never really been solved, because it'd be a tendency perhaps to assume them having a big role. But I must say that I'm a little bit skeptical about it, because most cases are run by, you know, it's not repeat players, it's one shooters, you know, so you don't see that in the bigger picture. Secondly, and it's something I'll come back to, is that how do we distinguish really the impact of the litigation from the mass of other activities of organizations like the Open Justice Initiative, the Open Society Initiative? The causality is far from obvious, you know. So I'm lacking something statistical in a way that's trying to answer both of these questions, yet I do know it's very difficult to produce. Another thing that where I would do a little pushback, and it's in a way linked, there's a tendency in some of your writing that, you know, that's it's sort of implicit that because of private funding for some courses, it gets somehow harder for the ordinary claimants to come forward to the court. In my view, that's not entirely evident that that's the case in practice. It's of course evident that that NGOs and donors have priorities and they will prioritize certain cases. The literature is full of examples of this, and so is your book. But it does not necessarily make it harder per se for those not benefiting from NGO donor support. It might be just as hard as it was to begin with, you know. So it does not necessarily change the overall picture for litigants, that some of them are more in a more luxurious position. Then moving on with the questions, now they get a little bit more difficult, I would say. The first is linked to what I said before, but articulate a little bit differently, more conceptually. You know, so one of the hardest things in social science is, of course, to study influence and impact. But since we are missing a little bit that opening chapter that typically would define these concepts, so what we are left with is a lot of indications of such influence, but we are never really giving the tool for measuring it, you know, both from a quantitative or quantitative perspective. So how do you measure the fact that some private donors were involved and that possibly changed the course of things? It's not that I'm doubting that they had an influence, but I'm just lacking a broader discussion of what you define as influence besides the sort of more intuitive understanding of this. And this is, of course, a highly sensible matter when we're dealing with courts and judges, because how can we know that they were all swayed by they were at all swayed by strategies of donors, NGOs, and so on? And when and how does an intervention, third party or direct in litigation, actually change the course of a court case? You know, I need to know some more there, because to really prove the point. The second major point I have is, of course, something you can work on the rest of your life, and you're very welcome to do that. It is constantly, when I read the book, almost from page one, the question that popped up was the notion of privatization. This is, you know, a tricky thing. It's an intuitive notion, again, that is used in ordinary political speech, but as an analytical and sociological notion, I would have preferred a much deeper engagement what precisely it is from an analytical perspective. Or put more directly, because it has this common sense applicability, there's a great need for what a good old Pierre Bourdieu would have called a double rupture. We need to understand a little bit what it goes before it, the en pensée, you know, of the notion, to not step into its inherent politics. Because we all agree that privatization, besides its sort of descriptive elements, refers to a political transformation of sorts. And there's something more about privatization, because foundations and donors are not the only indications of such transformations when we talk about the privatization. One thing are these foundations and their economic clout. Another are the more traditional private actors in these regards, which also have considerable means for furthering their agendas. And I'm thinking about also some repeat players before the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice, for example, trade unions, newspapers, and so on. It's a very different set of private actors that perhaps fit more in a sort of a more ordinary European perspective of politics. And this is also where you could have done more about the differences between the two courts. The kind of foundations, these big four American and a little bit of Tetra Pak from Sweden, that you mentioned, fit much better into the human rights battles around the European Court of Human Rights than they actually do before the Court of Justice. And I would say that the book is perhaps a little bit tilted towards Strasbourg rather than Luxembourg in this regard. I would think that precisely in Luxembourg, you will find a different set of interests at play to a large extent. Among the Americans, for instance, it's not the Ford Foundation, it's Microsoft and Facebook you will find as litigants and interest there. So they might be fitting into Christina's definition still, but they're still different. And then a final comment, which is really a bit of a query, and it's also to give you a suggestion for the next book in a way, volume 2. It was a little bit surprising to me, considering where you're from and your background, that you don't cite the influential work of Yves de Soleil and Brian Gass, who in some ways have pioneered the thinking about foundations and human rights practices, and very heavily influenced some of the works that you actually do cite. And they have a very strong Bourdieuian thesis, namely that when you export a particular form of practice, you also tend to export the underpinning social battles and structures that form that practice in the first place. In other words, the model does not just travel without its context. And these are some much deeper sociological questions, which I think you need to address at some point, preferably in book number 2. Because if you really want to dig into the question of privatization, you also need to understand the different forms of privatization. Because the foundations you deal with from the US are foundations that have been there for almost 100 years in some instances. They are part and parcel of a particular fabric of American society. Their introduction in a European context, it means something else, where foundations, whether it's in Denmark, the Carlsberg Foundation that sponsors basic science, or the Volkswagen Stiftung in Germany that also sponsors basic science, like we're doing, all of us, it's very different from the Ford Foundation that has this more activist agenda. So there's something to be said there. And then finally, we need to get a definition of what privatization as such means. Besides the obvious point, it must be a social order where public institutions play a decreasing role. So these would be my sort of suggestions for going forward. But let me finish again by congratulating with an excellent book, and I look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Shall I spell it? Also, Michael. It's Michael. Yes, okay. So thank you, Michael, for your comments. And I would suggest to start with Michael's questions and comments, perhaps, and go backwards, because as far as I know, Michael has to leave in 30 minutes, perhaps. And then let's have a discussion first with Michael and then go backwards. Yeah, Gaëtan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you.
Just one more comment. Actually, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to intervene anytime, then let's do it. All right.
Thank you very much for all your comments, and I think they are very useful to improve and to further this work, this ongoing work, as you told me, Michael. So thank you very much again. The first question related to how pervasive this phenomenon is, and the fact that the number of cases is relatively low or weak compared to a traditional quantitative approach. I will reply. The response is, I think that there is a double response. First, sometimes you need just a pilot judgment to have a big influence, and judges are very aware of this. So I don't think that, and I remember that Elisabeth Lambert, who is also attending the symposium, asked me for more quantitative data, and I think it could be the case with the second book on this topic. But honestly, I think that the quantitative aspect is not dominant, in the sense that we have, I think, in the book, there is enough jurisprudence to see how these judgments, especially these pilot judgments, operate a certain change in the jurisprudence, and also in spreading certain moral values. So you have also, and also there is a second argument, in the sense that there are not only pilot judgments, but there are also landmark judgments that are like a cornerstone for the European Court of Human Rights, and also for national jurisdictions. So I won't, because I have to respond to all these questions. But I think you can find in the book all this jurisprudence which has a real influence. And of course, I think I can also quote or refer to other books and other scholars who have influenced and studied the influence of the case law and the judgments delivered by the European Court of Human Rights and also the Court of Justice of the European Union. And the second aspect of my response concerns the procedural aspect, because you never mention in this influence, I think there are several influences, and there is a procedural influence. And the procedural influence is the fact that these private foundations have obtained altogether the fact that they have obtained the pilot judgment procedure and the constitutionalization of the European Court of Human Rights. And what means the constitutionalization? The European Court is in capacity now to select the complaints and the cases it wants to further and to advance on and to judge. So, of course, it's an advantage for professional lawyers and professional structures compared to individual parties and individual complainants, litigants. And this is another response to your question about individuals. I think they are disadvantaged, especially regarding the procedural aspects. I won't give details on this because it is developed to a certain extent in the book. Strategic litigation compared to other activities, I don't know. It's a very good question. I don't know if we can separate or isolate lobby or political activities from strategic litigation, because we know that the lobby is both judicial, political, and especially regarding procedural, the procedural influence, the political lobby is exerted to obtain more favorable procedural rules that enhance the influence for litigation purpose. So you can't isolate, but I'm also aware that strategic litigation is certainly a very weak instrument to influence all the staff, and especially the change in regimes as noticed by Christina. So I think it's you're right in the sense, and it's especially the case, I think, for the European Court of Justice, the Court of Justice of the European Union. You have many cases in which the European Commission is the litigant. And what is interesting is this lobby. This is an indirect lobby, in the sense that the European Commission is lobbied by some private foundations, and then the European Commission can use and apply the same arguments used by these private foundations. This is also legal arguments. So there is, I think, what is also missing in my work is the way some political and moral arguments are turned into legal arguments, and conversely, how legal arguments reflect moral values and so forth. So I think that there is more room for these two, but this is an excellent question. Many thanks, Michael. Regarding the influence and impacts, how can you measure impact? This is, of course, a traditional question, and perhaps that you didn't mention capture in itself, but it's not perhaps the best notion or the best concept to encapsulate the phenomenon. I think to respond to you that several phenomena are at stake. You have the process. If I want to just enumerate the kind of influence, you have first and I didn't mention this aspect in the book, but it's clearly the case, and I'm working on this currently on this. You have the doctrinal influence. The fact that many workers and litigators working for private foundation, they participate in scientific conferences, they write articles, even books. And this is a way of influencing all the staff and the European Court of Human Rights, especially because you have, when you take a look and you analyze the dissenting opinions made by judges, you can see sometimes this literature quoted and cited so you have this first aspect, this doctrinal or literature aspect. Second aspect is the way legal strategies are used in a broader way. So you have, for instance, of course, the complaint and the way, for instance, how private foundations can make some cartels, or for instance, they don't want to be cited in direct complaints, because otherwise they would not be in capacity or able to submit third-party interventions, amici curiae. So, because the judge will not, the president of the section of the panel, who has the discretion to decide which amici curiae is able to be accepted or not. If the name of the parties of the litigants are cited in the direct complaint, it will be not accepted if amicus curiae is also submitted. Okay, so what we can see, and this influence is quite subtle in the sense that the phenomena is more and more deeper than on the surface, you know, because direct litigants are cited, but not, they intervene as counsels, you know, and they are not cited in the judgments. So you cannot have direct access to this knowledge. This is very intelligent. This is clever, honestly, and this is a legal strategy which is very oftenly used. So it could be studied in the next study on this. The second influence regarding legal strategies is the fact that they use the additional interventions, like a cartel. So, for instance, regarding amicus curiae, they are in capacity all together, for instance, for the neoliberal side, to have meeting before, and then to decide to make a complaint all together, or to submit a third-party intervention. So there is a collective aspect, a collective work, which is also under the surface, you know. So I think there is more room for investigating also this aspect and this influence. But how to qualify it? Of course, this is quite complex. Quantify. Well, quantify. Sorry. Fourth influence is the way these judgments are politicized, and how they are politicized also at the international political level, and how these judgments are relayed to directly transmitted to international organizations. For instance, the IMF, the European Commission, the Council of Europe, some institutions like the Parliamentary Assembly or the Committee of Ministers, and these international institutions can sometimes adopt sanctions with regard to the judgments obtained by these private foundations to blame and shame these countries that are not compliant with the judgments rendered by the European Court of Human Rights. So And of course, to go further to your perhaps last question, and I totally agree with you concerning the difference, perhaps the concept of privatization. I agree with you on this. Perhaps it was not such a good fit or such a good concept to study this phenomenon. But how to qualify, how to analyze this? This is a private influence anyway. Even tough private foundations are part of the landscape for 100 or more time. And of course, there is, you didn't mention it, but there is some, there is alliance with some states and with private foundations, and how they act together to obtain some condemnations of certain Eastern countries and so forth. So, of course, I agree with you. Privatization is quite blurred by also this alliance with the public, with some national states. But anyway, concerning the difference, I also agree with you regarding the difference between the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice. But as I told you, I think we have also to analyze the role played by the European Commission that is lobbied by these private actors. Regarding last reaction regarding Dozale and Garth, I completely agree with you. Antoine Vaucher told me I had exactly the same reaction to my work, and he suggested me, but the book was already published, so sorry. So for the next book, I promise I will cite them, and of course there is a neoliberal context that is not limited to this influence played by private foundations. You are right to a certain extent. So how to also separate or isolate these factors? This is quite complex, I think. Thanks.
Michael, do you have any comments on Gaëtan's answers?
No, they are excellent. I think he should move on to the next one. Thank you, though.
Okay, thank you.
So Roselyne, in the
yes
reverse sense, okay. Yes. So many thanks, Roselyne. I was very interested in your work on democracy, on the Greek democracy, on Aristotle, and I'm quite fond of Plato. So I think that there is also this tension between the democracy and the not the plutocracy, but the oligarchy, not promoted by Plato, but it's there is a big doubt from Plato on the possibility of democracy. So so I think this is your premise. You know, I think. I don't know if I'm right, but Aristotle seems to be your author, your Greek author. You like to refer to. But anyway, regarding NGOs and grassroots actors, I agree with you. Of course, I think that there is a question of legitimacy here. Do these NGO represent people and the civil society, or do they because they are they are not elected, but they can represent a real trend in society, and they are really representative, or do they represent some private interest represented by billionaires? I think that it's a big question. So of course, I think that when you pointed out the tension or the conflicts between a globalization or and opponents in terms of national interest or populist and so forth. I was surprised because I had a talk with Gregor Pupink. I imagine you know him, the head of the European Center for Law and Justice. And I was surprised because I expected his organization to be very nationalist and so forth, and he told me absolutely not. And he gave me some arguments, and this is more empirical, but for instance, his organization promoted Christian globalization and not nationalism. So, so perhaps you could have a tension between globalization and nationalism, but you could also have a tension between two trends, not secular moral globalization, because I'm going to respond to this argument. I think there is no secularism from the open society, because they defend Islamic veil, the Islamic veil for women in the SAS judgment against France. They defend witness Jehovah in several cases against Romania and Bulgaria. So I don't think it's so secular, contrary to a public representation or a traditional representation. So regarding the European project, I fully agree with you. What is the European project? If you put aside the traditional little music, you know, on Schumann and so forth, this is an American project. And as Michael wrote, the American project was to create an American structure in Europe against communism. It was clearly the case, and it has been the case. The funds provided from the American Foreign Affairs Department and the funds were given to the private foundations like Rockefeller Foundation, also the Ford Foundation, to finance European movements. So Scott Smith has written on this several books, and it's well known. And of course, there was a role already played by this American private foundation to influence the European movements and the federal movements in particular, to have, you know, a federation, a European federation, like in the US. That was the model. So, of course, and I think there is also a parallel with the US in the sense that you have also an oligarchy in the US, financial oligarchy, and the American Constitution has been written down to try to probably limit this influence with big institutions, influence institutions, state institutions, and so forth. And perhaps that it was less the case in Europe. And I think this is one of the problem, because the EU has clearly chosen to collaborate with the Open Society, with the Ford Foundation, and so forth. And this is a political choice, I think, clearly. I don't know if I think you also mentioned the political influence, and not only in the judicial influence, but I think I have already responded to Michael regarding this question. So. And geopolitical interests, the way geopolitical interests are intertwined with the legal framework and how they are both captured by the oligarchy, and the backlash and of course, I think that there is also perhaps tensions between natural law and secular law or a secular vision of human rights. And during the COVID, I think we have seen this conflict between natural law, like in Antigone, in the Sophocles. To come back to the Greek history and the Greek literature, Antigone just claimed that the natural law, but during the COVID, is the right to health predominant and can be so important that it can be coercive, and then it can completely suppress other rights, or other human rights are completely blinded or just shut down by this right to life and right to health with their coercive dimensions, or do we accept a balance between these two trends? So I think regarding the backlash, it also has an importance in this debate.
Rosalind, do you have any comments or response to Gaëtan?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that. I think for me, the big issue is what is the basis for the legitimacy of an organization? Like, most of us have the right to association, the freedom to associate, and that is in order to influence the political process. But you would know, right? If an organization, even a union, which could be like quite coercive to its members, you could say we represent so many members. We have 10,000 members or 100,000 members. Or if you're a think tank, fine, you're there to give advice. But what we have now with these organizations is a situation where they're making a small movement look like a very big movement. So it's kind of about distorting that public perception, if you want, mainly, but also then potentially, through judicial decisions as well. Like regarding what Mikhail said, they only did like 47 court cases out of 20,000. Sure, but if it's 47 more than you would have had otherwise, it's always that bit of distortion, that bit of like to move, I would say, the scale towards what you want to represent. And I think from a legal point of view, we have these freedoms to protect people, to protect democracy, to guarantee that we can, associate and make an organization to, if you want, ideas and act politically. But we're seeing that, in my view, kind of being distorted and abused, I would say in German verwirrt, by being captured by an organization that isn't doing those things. That's being run by like paid staffers. They're not there because they believe in the organization. They're there because they're paid to be there. So I think that's, for me, the key is like, what is the basis of the legitimacy of these organizations? Because we have that with everything. We have that with private companies as well. You have a charter. You're permitted to build this company. You're permitted to have this association. And there's this kind of monopoly of state power, if you want, that we all have a right to complain to and to work on, that's sort of being shredded to some extent by this counter movement, if you want. That would be what I would say anyway about that.
Yeah, I fully agree. What is the source of legitimacy? I would say election, of course, and this is one of the issues. Because these judges are only 3 of them are nominated by their own government, and then they are elected by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. But the source of legitimacy is quite weak. Perhaps, as for the US, they could be directly elected. Of course, there are also other issues, but I think and this is also the case for the European project, except the European Parliament. What is the source of legitimacy? Regarding the influence it exerts, I know we can try to define influence and to quantify it, but honestly, it's quite huge. And so I completely agree. Election and also participation of people into this in these institutions or in the projects promoted by these institutions. So I think there is room for more participation and more legitimacy.
Right. Kirsty? Yes.
Yes, sure. I just wanted to jump into this conversation as it's something that truly fascinates me and something that I've written on in a different context. But I think, there's a case here to be made in terms of participation in democracy that needs to be distinguished between the national and the international. It operates very differently, and the sources of legitimacy and authority is very different, from the national to the international. This also obviously concerns these NGOs, right? Whether you are part of civil society in a national society or part of global civil society at the global level is very different. Now, and I think, I think there's a case here to be made that these organizations, they base their legitimacy to a great degree on moral authority. That is sort of what the claim that they often make. But moral authority is at the same time based on, an assumption of outsiderness, of disinterest, of being beyond politics. And I think what this work really shows is that this isn't so at all. They are deeply entrenched and deeply embedded in the system to the extent that it completely evaporates their claim to moral authority, right? So this is sort of the tensions that I think this work really brings to the fore. I just wanted to say that I think this really adds to that kind of critique of their claim to legitimacy, which is often then based on moral authority and of course transparency, which they aren't either.
Thank you. Gaëtan, shall we go to Christina's comments?
Of course, with pleasure. So many thanks, Christina. I think you summarize my way of reasoning in a brilliant way. But I would like to respond to several aspects you raised in your questions and your comments and remarks. So commercial reasons, of course, but also they are also linked to the to the way of thinking or to the habitus of the elite, of this economic elite. I think this economic elite is very fond of world government, and there are many evidences, because when I went to New York to consult the archives, and also when I had several assistants who went to Budapest to consult the archives at the Open Society Foundation, we can see, and perhaps it's also a response to Michael, the judicial area is very small compared to all their investment in many social fields and domains. And this is quite striking because effectively the judicial domain is so weak compared to all the investment. But this is also terrific because, for instance, jazz is they like jazz, because it's like a destructuration, and they like the chaos in the sense. Of course, sometimes they also like classical music, but classical music, you have different trends in classical music. In general, they don't like Bach or the traditional Bach. They like to destructure Bach, and this is quite interesting. I'm also a musician and then a pianist, and then it's quite. I was very interested in such investment. Why so much jazz? And for a classical musician, it was quite shocking to see all this investment we can like jazz. It's not a problem, but why? So much money on jazz. Okay, that was just the funny moment. Anyway, so the world government, I think, allows the elite to concentrate more wealth Because if you can lobby just several international institutions, it's more convenient. You spare sometimes, it avoids you to traveling, to developing your network in all national states. If you have worldwide structures, it's more effective in terms of lobby. And it's just a lobbyist vision, or you know, and that's true also for economic reasons, but also there is a deeper interest in moral values, because economic values are just the top of the surface. But if you can promote consumers, how they have to consume the products and so forth, it's good for the business, you know. So all these areas are connected to me, and this is why world government is I think is the and when I saw all this investment in different areas, they all converge, they all intersect in this world government project, you know, because all investments are in domains with international projects, you know, international institutions, how to develop, for instance, the international criminal court you studied, Kirsty. The origin of the project is the Rockefeller Foundation, you know, because they in Italy, you can find a place, the Serboni location, the Serboni Villa, which served to enhance the project of this court. This is crazy, you know, when you consult the archives of the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, that you can see even the International Criminal Court was a creation of a private foundation. So regarding, I agree with the culture war. Yeah, you prefer the culture war to the core law. Perhaps it's a more preferred expression or more convenient expression to encapsulate the phenomenon. I think I have also tried to react to the conservative values, or the fight against conservative religious values when I mentioned the question of secularism, which is not really promoted by this foundation when you just take a look at the Muslim veil or the Jehovah's Witnesses. So regarding the regime change, this is a big issue and very interesting point. I think, and Agustin Menendez, you know, I'm very indebtful to Agustin, because he accepted to publish my work on this problematic issue in the European Law Journal, and Agustin was also very aware of how Putin represents a danger for this elite, because it is really I think Putin has his own oligarchs to promote, and they are not the oligarchs those coming from the Western world. So, the coup d'etat, or more than a coup d'etat, I think it's a progressive change, you know, and sometimes it takes 10 years to obtain a change in the jurisprudence, in the values. First, you obtain, and this is a legal strategy. First, these private foundations and NGOs are aware that they will not obtain a positive judgment to their claims. But they will obtain the fact that their case will be selected by the European Court of Human Rights. Then second step, they obtain a second kind of judgment with dissenting opinions from the judges. And then the process is on the way. And third step, it can be relative acceptation, or some arguments can be accepted by some judges, and then you have. So I think the coup d'etat perhaps is very progressive, you know, and it's on the long run. Then you can obtain sometimes it's quicker or it's faster, but honestly it's a long way to obtain a regime which is in adequacy with the economic orientations promoted by such an elite. Regarding the media agenda, yeah, you're right, but honestly, I think it has to be deeply, in a deeper way, investigated. The relationship between this economic elite and the media, how this elite also. I saw in the archives, in the Ford and the Rockefeller archives, effectively the way the elite can finance certain newspapers, TV, radio, and so forth. For instance, European and international media. It's always the same trick. Of course, but I think it has been more. It has to be more investigated. Yeah. I think that's it. I don't know if
Christina, do you have any comments?
Yes, I fully agree that we need to do more research on the connections with the media, and the conversation that we're having now, this can be something that the media can pick up if they're really interested, and they can make these philanthropists as controversial as they are. And the fact that so few people, so little has been written about it, and so few people think about these things in these terms, even the fact that, I mean, you yourself seem to have been surprised to discover that the people behind the foundations were financiers and bankers and not philanthropists. You know, media can find this out and publicize it if they really wanted to. That's why I think it's really important to look into those connections and what kind of media was being left out, and how these foundations are being portrayed and how their political enemies are being portrayed. The other thing I would say is that I think we would be beneficial, it's something that I didn't do in my book, to place our work in the broader literature that would span Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, and the LSE sociologist Leslie Sclare's. She's written a lot on transnational capitalists, on the transnational capitalist class, and also Samuel Huntington's observations of the American transnational elite class. We can certainly, and that would broaden a little bit the horizon. And I think mapping those network connections, I don't think we need to measure things and quantify things. Mapping the network connections and establishing that there is a consensus on what kind of public policy is desirable and what is not might actually be sufficient. And the way I interpret the fact that so many cases are being rejected, so many cases against Russia are being rejected, is that perhaps there is some independence left in the supranational court. So they are trying, a lot of money is being put into bringing cases to court, very large number, but perhaps the courts are not haven't been completely captured.
Right, thank you. And then let's finish with Kersti's comment and your answer to Kersti's comments.
Yeah, just to react to one minute or half of a minute. Yeah, Christina, I agree on this quantitative approach, which is not really necessary regarding the judicial influence. But in a future project, in a future research project, my ambition is to create a database just to map all the decisions litigated and obtained by private foundations, just to objectify this influence, this private influence, or not private, but and so I think it could be like a basis for quantitative studies. I'm not fond of quantitative studies, but if there are some scholars who want to study this phenomenon quantitatively, why not? If they have time to.
My impression is the more systematic you make a piece of social science research, the more you lose out in terms of insight, and you get so caught up in the details of the method that you actually lose sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Kirsty. All your comments are very welcome, and I agree with most of them. Perhaps you also pointed out a very good point regarding the training of lawyers. I think which is completely overlooked or neglected by the book. So it could be a good point to study in the future. Regarding the current context, so the Russian versus Ukrainian war, I think this is the result of the phenomena I tried to study in the book, because shaming Russia, and I recognize that Russia, I'm not pro-Russian, but I'm never pro-Ukrainian. So even if one of my sons learn Russian, because I think it's very interesting to have a large and broad background, and not only an American culture. So I think honestly that Russia commits some human rights violations, but the way there is a double or sometimes a triple standard in the way this European institution react to them, because there are also human rights violations committed by Western countries, which are very less neglected.
But I just say something.
Yeah.
There are also many violations committed by China that the International Criminal Court can prosecute. But
of course. So Russia, I think, had already the project to withdraw from the Council of Europe. So it's not big news in the sense that the Council of Europe knew that Russia, for instance, blocked its financial participation already in 2019 and 2018. There was already big conflicts between the Council of Europe regarding the execution of the Gaëtan judgments, for instance, and especially the war against terrorism, the war on terror led by Russia in some countries. So I think it's not really new. And of course, regarding the Russian side of the story, We know that NATO has already this project to put some pressure on Russia regarding its military missiles, and so Russia feels the NATO project like an aggression, and it reacts against this aggression, but globally this Western aggression. What the European people, I think, missed or underestimate, I think that Russia is absolutely not isolated. They are part of BRICS. They are allies with China, with Brazil, with India, with many countries in the south. And in Asia, it's an Eurasian agreement and so a network. So I think they missed an opportunity to integrate Russia in the Council of Europe and even in European Union. They made a mistake, honestly, because it was more interesting to have Russia with us than Russia against us. This is honestly, on a diplomatic side, it's a big mistake. But of course, responsibilities can be shared between Russia and us. But we made also some real mistakes, and we missed the opportunity to have Russia with us. Now it's over. It's over. The game is over. And perhaps you know that Russia was the most contributor to the Council of Europe, the most financial contributor to the Council of Europe. Now the Council of Europe will have to face financial issues, real financial issues without Russia. And that's it, because there are also Russian allies like Azerbaijan that wants to also withdraw in the future. So Russia is not alone. Yeah, Christina.
What I was going to say, I think that the idea of that Russian that one can bring the president of a country that has nuclear weapons before a panel of Western lawyers, I don't think is very realistic. I mean, Russia is not Serbia, so I don't think that's going to happen.
Regarding the literature, I fully agree with you. My stance or the choice I made regarding the literature was certainly, and as you mentioned also, Christina, very narrow or tiny, and of course there is a need for a more transnational approach, elite literature on elite, on cause lawyering. But I'm going to be frank and honest with you. You know, cause lawyering is more interested traditionally in the front office than in the back office. I respond that when at another symposium, because I had to respond to a question also about cause lawyering, and that by a representative of cause lawyering literature. And then I said, yes, but you have both. You have not only lawyers working at a front office, you know. You have also founders, you have also finance, you have donors, and you have also a hierarchy, a legal and financial hierarchy. So I think, yeah, I want to discuss this literature, but it could be because in France, for instance, Israel works also on this, on such an aspect, and I think it's tricky for me to be frontal or to be in fight with her. Honestly, I like her work, but I think it has also some defects or some weaknesses. That's it, but I would like to do it. And also, I'm part of the Law and Society Association, And I don't want to be to have enemies in this association. I think there are some, you know, it's our research field or scientific field is quite complicated in terms of diplomatic relations, and I don't want to have many enemies in this domain. So because my approach is quite different, as you mentioned, and then. Okay. The work made by NGOs, the independence of there was no discussion on the evidence brought by NGOs in the book. I think you mentioned not a real discussion or not sufficiently developed. I think it was one of your points. And also the independence of the European Court of Human Rights, ironically, regarding NGOs. And I really appreciate your book too. For me, it's really a great book, and you show. I think you reached the same conclusion, perhaps differently. The NGOs are enrolled by the international criminal courts to be no longer watchers, but to be like an asset for the criminal courts. This is exactly, I think, the same, because the European Court of Human Rights, but also the Court of Justice of the European Union, have an interest in getting complaints of good quality and of very good quality regarding their own criteria, of course. First, it has a procedural aspect. They need complaints which comply with the procedural rules. And they are sure it will be the case with private foundation that bring complaints before the court. So to the court, they take their cases, and the cases will be formally accepted and will be formally compliant. So I think this is very important to underline that aspect, and this kind of alliance between the courts, the European courts, and these private foundations, because they can rely on each other to develop their own agendas and their institutional developments. So, but you showed very well this aspect, and it's fascinating to yeah, I think I have a PhD student who works on the evidence brought by NGOs, and of course this is a fundamental element in the ingredient in the demonstration, because since of course the way NGOs and private foundations are in capacity to bring evidence before the courts to feed and prove their assertions or their claims, their judicial claims, are fundamental in the, and they generally, this is part of their legal strategy. They are in capacity to first, sometimes before a case being lodged with the court, they are in capacity to produce, for instance, this is the case of Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, they are in capacity to produce some knowledge on a phenomenon. For instance, not private, but secret prisons run by the US in Europe. That was the case. And they produce some knowledge, some reports, which have some credibility and relayed by the media. As you told Christina, it's also an aspect of how some media are in capacity to relay these reports made by NGOs and released by NGOs and private foundation. And then there are sufficient grounds, social grounds, and social acceptability too, to lodge a case with the courts. This is the way it, but of course, I agree with you on the empirical side, the fact that you mentioned or you stress that there is a lack of empirical side or empirical data. I agree with you, but honestly, I want to be frank and direct and honest. I observed this phenomena when I was part of 2 researches financed by the European Union with several Helsinki committees. They were also they were involved in these both researches, and I was in capacity to collect many empirical data. But I don't want to use this data. You know why? Because I know some persons who will be sanctioned in these organizations. I don't want to do it for ethical reasons. And I think this is, you stress or you raised a fundamental issue in social sciences. What do we want? I know some research have made real harms to people working for some organizations. I don't want to use them, but I know there are many empirical evidences, and I observed them doing the participating in the research. And what I wanted, because I think that there is a lack of independence of my research, but I was in capacity, and I was criticized for this, to invite in my research center the head of the European Center for Law and Justice, just to have his account and just to balance, because there are two sides of the coin, and just to reach a balance between these both movements. But I think this is a common issue we have to address: how to make a research that does not harm people in organizations. Perhaps it's my imagination. I don't. Perhaps I anticipate too much the effects of. I don't know.
All right. So thank you, Gaëtan, for your answer. Kirsty, do you have anything to comment on the responses of Gaëtan?
No, I think he responded very thoroughly, and I mean, these are things that we could discuss days on end, and I hope that we do get an opportunity to meet and do so. But for the respect of time here, I think we'll have to leave it for another day.
All right. I think we are quite convinced that it should be made. I mean, the other day, another day for the discussion. So with that, thank you very much for everybody, for the panelists.
Public project, perhaps.
Yeah. I will send you an email, of course, about the publication of these comments in a special issue in a journal. But with that, thank you very much for your participation and for your comments, and Gaëtan also for your answers to the comments. And then let's keep in contact, of course. And then thank you very much once again.
Many thanks for your participation and your great comments and reactions and critiques. That's great.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.